Well, welcome in, everyone. Great to all have you here. We've just got a couple of folks still joining in at the moment. So just give it another 10 seconds or so, and then we can kick off. Excellent. All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Oliver Bruce. I am the host of the Micromobility Podcast, and I'm incredibly excited to be sharing this session today with Kristjan, Courtney, and Puneeth to talk about how does hardware have to be hard. And in particular, this is a topic of great interest to me. I have been doing the podcast now for almost 4 years, and we talk a lot to vehicle manufacturers and others in the space building hardware for micromobility. So I'm going to ask us to introduce ourselves and get a little bit more context on who we are and what we're doing and what we're bringing to this conversation. And then we'll shift on to talking, and we'll probably talk, I would imagine, for about sort of 35 minutes, probably between 35 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. So if you have any questions, please just put them there over in the questions area, and we will come back to them towards the end. But in the meantime, if we could have us introduce ourselves. If we go in the order of Puneeth, and then I think it's Puneeth, Kristjan, and then Courtney.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Puneeth. I'm a senior associate at Trucks Venture Capital. We're a seed stage fund that invests in all things transportation and mobility. We have a core thesis of making transportation safer, decarbonized, and more equitable. And so micromobility fits nicely within all three of those criteria. We've invested in roughly 6 or 7 different micromobility companies. I also personally author a newsletter called Flywheel. It's kind of a weekly exploration of the used micromobility market and really trying to use used as a lens to understand what the ownership experience for e-bikes and scooters looks like.
Fantastic. It's well worth checking out if you haven't already. All right, next up we have Kristjan.
Yeah, apologies for my marketing team for putting a very bossy picture here. I'm Kristjan. I'm running a group now called Comobility, and it holds several brands. One of them is Comodule, that's been around for 8 years. Comodule creates IoT devices, Internet of Things devices, to connect bikes and scooters to the internet. So it's a B2B offering, like a tier 1 supplier. And up to now, we have connected around 600,000 vehicles and producing around 250,000 units a year now. Then we have Aika, which is where we produce electric scooters. We're the only ones outside China to do that. We do it in Estonia. And we produce sharing scooters and consumer scooters. And in between, we have Tool, and this is where we actually run a small scooter sharing business ourselves, just to validate our technology. So that's also local in Estonia. And yeah, so this year we're doing around 25 million euros of revenue, and we're roughly 175 people, I think, if I'm correct. And the last one you can see is an internal business unit. So that means that we also produce everything we do in-house ourselves. So our goal is to be very vertically integrated. So you could also call me a dinosaur of the industry. We were here in 2014 when it was not yet called micromobility.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to digging into that part as well. You've certainly been around the block. Awesome, Courtney.
Yeah, awesome. So hi everyone, my name is Courtney Goodsell. Despite the last name, I am not in sales, but in fact I'm a product manager at a company called Mavenoid. Mavenoid, pretty apt for the topic today. We're trying to make hardware not so hard by providing a more scalable product support solution, specifically for hardware brands. So at the core, Mavenoid's aim is to help diagnose customers' issues and direct them to a solution path. and why we're here. So we've seen great successes with a lot of micromobility players such as Voi, Super Pedestrian, Theo, Polo Scooters, Mobi, just to name a few. And across these players, we've seen an average resolution rate of around 40%. So what we'd like to share with you guys today is how we've actually been able to do that and how we could actually make hardware a little less hard.
Fantastic. Yeah, so as you can see, team, we've pulled together quite an interesting panel here, and I've, as I mentioned, just to give a little bit of context on me as well. So the Micromobility Podcast has we've done over 1 million downloads, 150 episodes, and we also organise the Micromobility Conference as well. So we cover off this twice a year, once in San Francisco, once in Europe and in Amsterdam, with all of the top leaders in the space as well. Excellent. Well, look, I am very excited to start off with. Maybe what we can do is I really want to define what we consider hardware in this space, because I think what everybody kind of looks to and thinks, oh, it's only the vehicles. But I actually think that it can be quite a bit wider than that. And simply limiting us to the conversation of it's only it's the only privately owned and or shared vehicles is limiting to us. So I thought, Kristjan, you're probably the most appropriate to talk to that, given you have such a wide remit on the space. But I'm curious where you come to on what you would consider hardware, or like what's the limit of where you'd say hardware exists, and then Puneeth, if you could just add anything else you'd want in that space.
I don't know. It's a very good question. I mean, I actually had some thinking about it. So, and I think the simplest thing is that everything you can touch with your hand is hardware, because it's hard when you knock on it, right? So yeah. I think I would limit it there, and for sure, it's the vehicle, it's the IoT, it's this modern AI-based camera systems. So I think it's everything where you need a physical product. But if you also look what we do at Comodule, it's not that we just build hardware. So what we say at Comodule is we build connectivity as a service. So we have a hardware element to it. There's an electronics device with a battery inside a black plastic box. Has a wire sticking out of it. But this is basically the enabler of the service, right? So at Comodule, we supply the hardware, but it's also our job to make sure that there's a great connection between the vehicle and the cloud. So we actually always move the data ourselves. We take care of the telco contract, global roaming, and we also have our own server space where we accept the data. And we believe that you can only build a good connectivity product or service when you control both ends. Because, for example, we have almost, I would say, maximum level of security. And this is because we have 2 passcodes, and one of the passcodes is hard coded to the hardware when we make it. And only we know that this hardware has this passcode. It's like a physical key, basically. So sure. If you control both of the ends, you can make sure it's cheap, it's rigid, robust, and safe and secure. So hardware ends where's the product is, but hardware enabled services don't just have to be built on hardware. So that's how I would conclude it.
Fantastic, excellent. Puneeth, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly that last point is really important. Really, even the software that maybe you're actually only building software, but if it touches hardware, I would consider that to be a hardware company. When you think about micromobility, you can't really build a compelling software product for the space without thinking about the hardware that you're integrating to, the hardware that you're reliant on, the hardware that might place risks on your product that you're not aware of. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you need to think about it from both perspectives.
Because yeah, I think just to add to Puneeth is because even if you're just a software company, but it runs on specific hardware, and it's not really, a very well controlled environment like the App Store. If you build apps, then you don't really have to care too much about exactly what's the Apple. But if it's not that much of a control system, then your risks are associated with hardware. So you can be a kind of a software only player, but if it runs on somebody else's hardware as well, then you have a big risk with that. So in that sense, your risk is still hardware.
Totally. And that's actually part of one of the things that I was also going to kind of frame up is like, I actually think if you're in a shared mobility game, even though you're not, you might be, for example, running a scooter fleet. It's not your hardware. I mean, but you're really, you might be just servicing and operating this, but like you're in the hardware game as well, right? Like you're absolutely dealing with hardware and from an operational perspective, but also having to deal with all the other stuff of having to troubleshoot, et cetera, et cetera. So look, I think that's a very appropriate framing, and I think you each come to this with really like a very different perspective. So when we talk about hardware is hard, I'm I think that's a kind of a trope that I think a lot of people roll out, but one that's probably very appropriate. And I thought what we'd start off with is like in your particular industry. So for you, Courtney, with Mavenoid, you, Puneeth, thinking about investing, and then for you, Kristjan, with both the hardware side from the from the IoT module aspect, but also running a shared scooter company and also doing consumer scooter. Curious for each of you, like when we say hardware is hard, what does that mean? Like, why is it hard in your particular vertical? So maybe we start with you, Courtney, and then Puneeth, and Kristjan.
Yeah, certainly. So when we're looking at hardware support more specifically, it comes down to this complexity of using, maintaining, and then ultimately fixing these physical products. And I mean, if you look at direct to consumers, many customers are used to returning or simply returning their products when they don't work, or ringing up the call center and demanding a refund. And we kind of have to look at why that is the case, and typically it's because these customers are given 500-page manuals which they throw out the day that they purchase the item, or they've trawled the internet and found FAQ sites that present them non-relevant information. Then in the shared space of micromobility, the moment the customer contacts a brand for support, their happy path of customer experience is ultimately completely disrupted, especially when the core USP is that you don't have to talk to anyone to begin or end your journey. And then when these issues are time sensitive or financially sensitive, brands are set into a panic in being able to provide not only a solution, but be able to do it quickly and 24/7. So this ultimately leads to the idea that hardware is hard based on these complexities.
Yeah. So good. So much in there that I'm looking forward to unpacking. All right, Puneeth.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really two pieces of this that's most relevant to what we do at Trucks. Number one is obviously around fundraising. Building hardware and scaling hardware is very expensive, and oftentimes equity alone isn't necessarily the best form of financing for everything that a hardware company does. And so how do you kind of build out a portfolio of different fundraising sources to be able to effectively build out your manufacturing without necessarily diluting the entire company is a big question that I think a lot of our hardware companies have to answer. Number two, for our investment to be successful, ultimately it does depend on happy customers and a successful product. And I think one of the big things that we've noticed is within hardware, there's not as many obvious recurring feedback loops like you have with software. And so it's hard to know when a product is doing well in the market versus when it's not. Especially with newer hardware, people don't really contact the brand until the product is not working or it's beyond the state of repair. And so you've kind of missed out on a lot of valuable information that allows you to direct the next steps of focus for your company. And so that's, I think, one of the other key pain points that we've been exploring a lot with all of our portfolio companies as well.
Fantastic. Well, Kristjan, you might have something to offer in that space with IoT.
Yeah, I think Puneeth really touched a very important point, and that was how do you finance a hardware business, and why is it more difficult than just financing a software business? Is that you just don't need money to pay salaries, but you need a lot of money to have stock, just to buy things and then put those things on a PCB board or put them together as a scooter and sell them. And the problem is that if you grow quickly or you're in a fast growth situation, then let's say you sell a product for 100 euros and your cost of goods, the part cost is, let's say, 60 or 70 euros. If you sell it, your gross margin is 40, but if you're growing, twice every month or quarter or whatever, then for that 40, you don't get the parts for the next vehicle, right? You actually get only like 70% of the parts for the next vehicle, but you still have to pay your salaries as well. So when you're growing really, really quickly, your number one thing is going to be cash flow. Like, how do you manage your stock levels, and how do you have, cash flow that is operating inside your company? And I think a lot of hardware, whether they're startups or just early companies, have been kind of victims of their own growth. And the worst thing you can do is that to fuel that growth, you're going to do, equity investments. Because at one moment, then you discover that, hey, I only have 15% of my company left because I've given out equity to build stock, right? And it's the thing you should not do at all. And I think it's the mistake all of the first generation micromobility companies did as well, scooter sharing companies. Like, they all got shitloads of money, and then they just bought scooters. And then at one moment they understood they don't have that scooters, because for equity you should build IP, you should build value. But if for equity you buy assets, then that's not really the way to go. So this is, I think, a very fundamental thing everybody should understand when they are in hardware, from like a company building perspective. When you look from the product side, then the biggest difference is that you can mess up big time, right? If you ship a product and it's not properly tested, and it doesn't have an IoT, then I wouldn't ship it. So I would only ship a product that has IoT, because then you can do over-there software updates. But even then, sometimes the over-there software updates don't work. So it's just so much more risky. So you can, produce millions of units and ship them out, worth of millions of euros or tens of millions. And then if you have a systematic flaw there, then you're just going to be in huge trouble. So I think these are the two main things. And of course, the third one, when you look back in the past 2 years, is that you might end up in a situation where you just can't build your product because you can't get parts, right? When you have a component crisis or like the chip crisis has been. So I always made this, the past 2.5 years, we've been constantly hustling and struggling, but we made it. But whenever I meet my software guys, I try to explain them to that. Imagine you go to work at one moment, and then one of your developers comes and says, sorry, but the Amazon Web Services just ran out of space. So we can't actually grow our services anymore, right? And then you're like, yeah, okay, whatever, but let's go to Google Cloud. And the guy says, we can't. Google is full as well, and then, okay, let's go to Microsoft. Microsoft is full as well. So what do we do? I don't know. We can't grow. So, software people don't have these problems, right? So 3 things: growing a company, you need a lot of cash flow, you can mess up big time, and you can actually be in a place where you can grow and you have need for the product, but you just can't get your parts. So these are, I think, the 3 main things that really make it hard.
Yeah, that's thank you, because I think you really nailed it on the head, Kristjan. The one I actually want to double down on with you is in some ways though, I feel like the IoT element of the business, a lot of hardware, right? It's like relatively low margin, and like one of the things that I think has been really interesting, and certainly the reason that Horace, who's my co-host for the podcast, and I have certainly thought that micromobility holds a lot of potential, is because it's very similar to a lot of like consumer electronics that are like relatively high margin. That the consumer electronics business is actually coming out of the growth of smartphones and personal computers, can be slightly more forgiving than, for example, with like relative other not electronics industries where there aren't, for example, as higher margins. Do you consider that with IoT? Is it slightly more forgiving in the hardware business than, for example, other quote unquote hardware businesses? For example, bikes that might only have like 5% margin on them or 10% margin on them.
Yeah, bikes don't have a 5% margin. Maybe mechanical bikes, but not electric bikes. But I mean, yeah, of course, it's a completely different game, because if you look at a hardware company that makes 100 million euros of revenue, then the cost of goods of that might be, 70 million, 80 million, right? So the gross margin from where they actually can do R&D and pay salaries is maybe 20-30%. When you have a software-only company, if they make 100 million euros of revenue, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20% is like server costs and, direct costs to it. So 80% is the gross margin you can grow your team. So you always have to have this in mind when you look at hardware company revenues, for example, as well. But I mean, car companies make a lot of money as well when they do their things right. Some, I don't know, BIC, this BIC, the company that makes shavers,
Yes.
I would assume they have super small margins, but they're a huge company. So it's just different. It doesn't mean that it's better or worse. It's just different, and you have to look at it from a different angle and different perspective. But of course, it's bloody fantastic if you have a different type of a business model attached to it. So if a hardware is an enabler, you have some kind of a subscription service to it, as we have with IoT, or what I think is super exciting is, vehicle as a subscription. Like in Europe, you have swap feeds. Swap feeds are, Unagi is now doing it with scooters, where you yes have a hardware product, but you pay on it on a monthly basis, and it has a longer lifetime, and etc. So you can also sell insurance on top of that. So, as with everything, it's up to you to make cooler business models on top as well. So
Puneeth?
Yeah, I think the automotive analogy is really interesting here. I mean, the money that an OEM in the auto space make is not really from selling cars. It's from the services, it's from the parts, and it's from the used market. And I think one of the benefits that cars have, in addition to all of the infrastructure and financing that's kind of been given to them from the government, is that you have a dealership model that interacts with customers very well. And there's a lot of recurring services that people need to get. They know where to go, and that system is all set up. One of the difficulties, I think, with the micromobility companies that are now starting to think about these services to layer on top of their vehicles is they're not really designed to be able to be something you can interact with once they leave the door, right? And so it's hard to layer services on top of an e-bike or scooter when it's impossible to maintain it, when it's impossible to pull data from it. And I think there's a lot of things that need to be considered from the design and manufacturing side before you even think about, just selling it. There's more to selling it, and that needs to be considered when you're actually designing the vehicle.
Yeah, phenomenal. This leads me exactly where I wanted to go with Courtney. So Courtney, look, I think a lot of the micromobility hardware companies are struggling with a lot of, a number of them have taken on quite a lot of capital to build new bikes and vehicles, and they're getting a lot of orders from them, but they're also getting hamstring with like, I think what might be to folks who are from outside the industry around this, pretty predictable hardware problems. So, I know that a lot of them are doing, as Puneeth was mentioning, you're building these vehicles, but then we're going to like direct to consumer, and so we're shipping them. We're not doing them through the traditional channels that we have done in the past, for example, with like bike shops or other or the auto equivalent, which would have been like selling it through a dealer and then being able to have all the service and everything kind of attached to it. So I know that a lot of them are struggling with issues around shipping, troubleshooting, warranties, servicing. Can you talk through like your insights in this space? Because I know that you've dealt with a number of companies in this area, and like what you've seen done well and where you think there might be opportunities.
Yeah, so we can, I guess the whole framing of that is exactly what Mavenoid looks to address essentially. So looking to remove those repetitive problems from a business. So you mentioned about businesses investing an extensive amount of capital in building these new bikes and vehicles, where, sorry, can you guys hear me? It says I'm being cut out.
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so a lot of capital has been spent on these new bikes and new vehicles, but then what the thing is an element of neglect to the importance of product support in that journey. So we've invested all this time and money, but now how do we create happy and loyal users on the other side once they start utilizing those products? So we know exactly what they need from the product, but do we know exactly what they need from a product support standpoint? So what we tend to do with Mavenoid is, well, I'm going to use the doctor analogy, so apologies if you heard me speak about it before, but it kind of demonstrates how Mavenoid guides customers. But essentially with the doctor analogy, so a patient comes into a doctor, They say that they have a problem with their shoulder, and the doctor, with their years of expertise, their years of knowledge, is able to understand what questions to ask next of that patient to better prescribe a solution. And it's exactly the same, but we take the patient to be the customer coming in, describing their problem, and the doctor then is Mavenoid, and we ask a series of questions and promote a correct or point them to the most probable solution based on that customer, based on their issue, based on their product. So you mentioned direct to consumer, and we have a number of examples in that space. So you could shoot over to Apollo scooters as an example, where we preempted a number of those issues when it comes to the own space. So it's looking at proactive care as well. So where do we start in the user journey? So customer support starts with, does the customer understand that the product that they're buying, is it going to solve the problem that they're wanting even before they've received the purchase? Then how do we onboard them? Where is their order? So I mentioned Apollo scooters. We look at promoting product specifications. We look at automating order status, which you mentioned, a pretty clear one. All of these things which typically a brand is calling up the brand in order to solve. So a lot of time and money is being spent by agents answering these repetitive queries. But then you take it, and these are pretty standard problems. It's not particularly relevant just to the hardware space. You could say that the same thing happens with an item of clothing. But then we take it one step further with the hardware specific items. So looking at complex troubleshooting, where we are looking at, so Kristjan, I'm looking at you, of IoT, so IoT connected devices. How can we automate scenarios that agents are doing on the other end, such as ending my rides in shared mobility? Or even kind of going back, so you mentioned consumer goods, looking at automating the likes of warranties. So with Jabra, we reduced their time spent on warranty claims by something like 40%. Billing issues and end my rides, we increased customer satisfaction at Voi with 70%. Super pedestrian, we had a resolution rate of 60%. So ultimately, it's identifying those predictable problems and bringing them back into self-service, then reducing the cost for the brand.
Yeah,
what I would like,
can I just share this one thing? Because I heard it yesterday and I was blown away. But it was like a friend who runs a scooter company was saying that like 45% of their customer service inquiries are just from people who are having their scooter shipped to them and want to know when it's arriving. Like it was like, he was like, this is the most terrible use of our customer service people, because it's awesome because it's like clearly people are very excited and want to have their thing arrive, but like that it's a very automatable process, and I think it's one of these things that where I didn't think about it until, of course, I think there's a lot of folks in this industry, and Kristjan, I'll come to you in a second, but who I think really build like phenomenal product designers and think about building an amazing product, and then it's all the other stuff that sits around it that oftentimes kind of falls by the wayside, especially when they launch. It's just hard. It's a hard and challenging thing to be able to get a piece of hardware out the door. Kristjan, I want to ask you about that, because I was kind of surprised, inspired by the chutzpah of coming along and saying, because I knew you from Comodule, obviously, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, we're here we are with ICA, and we're building these we're building these amazing electric scooters, and for anybody who hasn't seen them, they're phenomenal. One, to ride, but also you should go check out the marketing videos, because I think you guys have like nailed the marketing better than most people in the industry. But yeah, like how did that journey go for you? In terms of thinking about it, and what's the pain points that you see as you're going through this journey of launching the Yakka scooter?
First of all, what I wanted to say for Courtney's or Mavenoid's business is that it's really there because you have a new way of doing things. You have then new services that you can automatically take a scooter from the street, and then what Puneeth pointed out before was that car companies have these huge dealer centers, and that's kind of where they make their money. And now these smaller vehicles are all now sold directly, right? And this is why you need these kind of services, that you're actually skipping the dealerships. And this is a trend that was there before the scooters and before the micromobility already, I would say 2015, 16, the first company started shipping directly. Canyon in the bike industry was the first one to really master it. And I think they have done it extremely well. And it's so cool to see how this, really changes how there's some companies are just coming out with this direct to consumer approach. And this also kind of leads to, what we do with iCase is we're building an end consumer product. We used to do a test with our first generation product, which was really made for sharing, but then we also did an end consumer kind of approach with it, and we tested whether we like it or not and whether people like the scooter. People didn't really like the scooter from the point of view that they wanted it still to be foldable. So we kind of brought out an iPad. It was like everybody's used to a computer and everybody's used to a mobile phone. And then we brought out the scooter that lives on the street, that you don't have to take it indoors. And it's really, really, really good and it can't be stolen. But it was too different for people. But we really liked what we did. And so we decided to build an end consumer scooter from scratch. And why I'm talking about this dealership or direct sales is that, for the past year, we've been looking a lot into how we're going to commercialize it. Are we only going to do online sales? Are we going to do a subscription model? And there's a new very cool thing in between, which are called, I think they called concept stores. So these are the kind of stores that offer different gadgets, different brands, and you don't pay them a part of the sales. You don't pay them X% of your vehicle. You pay them a fixed monthly fee. So you pay them like 3,000 euros per month for like 10 square meters. And the people working for the shop, they also present your product. So people can go there and do kind of test ride, see the product, touch it, and then they will still buy it online. So a very interesting hybrid setup for this new world. But I think your question was, how did we end up building scooters? And to get that straight, finally, is that we connected a lot of sharing scooters. So when the sharing scooter boom happened, we were the only company in the world that had industrial product to connect scooters to the internet. So in 2018, Comodule was about to produce around 6,000 units for the whole year. And then after the scooter sharing boom started and Travis put out those scooters with bird logo in Santa Monica, we got orders for 65,000 units in 3 weeks. So Lawrence from here, Frederick from Voi, Dot founders, everybody were on our Tallinn coach, on our coach in Tallinn, Estonia, every next day. So Lawrence was there while they didn't even have founded the company. So everybody was like, I want to do scooter sharing. Can you guys help me? I said, yeah, of course we can. So that was a huge boom for us. And retrospectively, our company grew, the output of the company grew 120 times in 5 months. So it was like a total wild, wild west, right? And I think the coolest moment was when we had 4 different operators operating in Oslo, Norway, and everybody had our connectivity. So like we basically had the data of the whole industry in one big city, and we could compare everybody to everybody, right? So, but I mean, nobody saw each other's data, but we had actually that data, but it was, useless. We didn't operate, so it wasn't really useful for us, but it was just a very crazy moment. And why we started building a scooter was that we fell in love of scooter sharing, how accessible it is, how everybody can ride it, that there's no learning barrier. I think a scooter is so much easier to ride than a bicycle even, right?
Sure.
So we really liked it, but we saw that it's horrible. If you looked at these first generation scooters, you just started to, as an engineer, your eyes started to bleed. It's just so bad. You couldn't look at it, these vehicles. They were like toys breaking into pieces, tossed into the rivers. So we had this, urge that why do you do it so badly? And then we visited Okai and we visited Ninebot and we also discussed integrating IoT. But then we saw that it's not really going to change. And so we just made this call and we said, hey, we love that industry, but this industry has no future if the scooters are so bad. And instead of just whining constantly, let's just make a difference. So we started building a scooter for the scooter sharing industry. That was 2020. So that was basically the main idea. But yeah, it's taken a long time.
Cool.
Oh, not much long, 2.5 years. But yeah, now we're getting into some numbers.
Marvelous. Well, look, I'm looking forward to circling back. I've got a couple more questions about it, but in the meantime, I do, Puneeth, I think there's an interesting question here around, like all of the things that we've been discussing. You mentioned in the beginning that the challenges of what that presents for you in terms of investing. Has this got any easier? Like, do you look at this now and think, compared to how it was even 3 or 5 years ago, that like the industry is learning and we're getting better at this, and therefore that you, from an investing perspective, this makes you more comfortable, or there are pathways for you to be able to get the sort of returns that you need to for your fund?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a financing perspective, it's gotten a little bit harder. The fact that a lot of the shared scooter companies have struggled to generate the money that the amount of money they've raised warrants has burned a lot of investors. And I think especially when you're kind of pre-product market fit, when you're in that moment before you validated that people want your vehicle, it's really hard to raise equity. And as such, especially for seed stage companies, the debt and credit financiers kind of look to how much equity you raise as a proving point as to whether they should give you debt or not. And so we've had a lot of companies that have had to really focus on kind of Kickstarter and a lot of those types of campaigns to generate pre-sales. And that's been an interesting kind of proof point for them to raise equity. And then they use that equity to go raise debt financing or credit financing. And eventually you kind of hop around back and forth between these different options until you get to the point where there's proven interest. I think particularly the e-bike boom and the own side of things has become a lot more comfortable for the debt financiers. And so for companies that have a product that is clearly in demand, we're seeing that debt financiers are a bit more willing to work with them. So I think from a financing perspective, it's gotten easier. From kind of a product maintenance and product longevity perspective, yes, people have now started to think about designing micromobility vehicles as opposed to toys. But I think perhaps wrongly so, a lot of people design vehicles in a way that they think the vehicle is unbreakable, and they think that's how they solve maintenance. And frankly, it doesn't matter how robust the vehicle is, it will break, something will go wrong. You just don't know how the customer is going to use it. And so the best companies that are manufacturing vehicles and selling to consumers, especially the D2C ones, are the ones that are thinking about the maintenance and customer experience even before they start building the vehicle. Those are the ones that we're seeing have the best traction, both with customers, but also with fundraising.
Yeah, phenomenal. Kristjan, because like you're obviously looking at launching the EcoScooter. Is it the sort of, how are you thinking about the customer service side with the different routes to market that you're thinking about?
Yeah, as I said, it's been working on it for a year now. I think that the beauty of a scooter is that if you fold it, end consumer scooter, if you fold it, you can really ship it relatively easily. So you can also, go to markets where you might not even have a dealership. So quite different from a bicycle. A bicycle is very difficult to ship. So basically, we are looking now at direct sales, and then most probably those concept stores that I briefly described. Not sure about kind of our own flagships, but I think we will for sure also look at some sort of service partners in hotspots here and there. The nice thing also of an electric scooter is that I think on a private use ownership, it actually requires very limited maintenance. I think it requires it once per year or so. But even if it's driven less than that, it might not even need that. I think Puneeth was mainly looking at shared scooters, and I think on shared scooters it's extremely important that when you're considering the lifetime of the scooter, is like a car. Car's lifetime is 15-20 years, but you're actually changing the brake pads maybe every year. You're changing the tires, your oil, the belts, etc. And this is very important when you build a vehicle for sharing or for some other heavy-duty use, that you actually design it in a way that the main construction will last maybe 10, 15, 20 years, but you can easily and reasonably replace the components that wear out. So this is extremely important to look at,
Yeah, this is the I'll give the example for me. I live in New Zealand, and I have one of my favorite scooters of all time was the Boosted Rev, which was a beautiful scooter made by Boosted, who are based in the States. They ended up going out of business, unfortunately, and so but for a long time I've ended up servicing my own scooter, and I tell you, it's like a battle. They're not the easiest and most serviceable scooters, and it's challenging, and there isn't a huge amount of support, because I don't think that they necessarily, there was like some elements of things that they could support me with, but a lot of it was not as, in terms of part supply, all that sort of stuff. It ended up being challenging.
And I mean,
Courtney,
just one thing to actually add.
Sure.
One thing to add here is why servicing scooters is difficult is because it's such an early industry. Like on bicycles, your tires are standardized, right? Whatever bicycle you have, you go to a bike shop, the guy looks at the tire, he's like, okay, it's this one, and then he just takes it from his stock, right? The parts there's a lot of parts that are very standardized, like on cars. But the scooter sharing as well as the ownership industry, the whole industry is so new that there's yet to be defined any standards. So if you buy a scooter and you get it and you're like, oh, my tire, busted, or my tire is broken. So you don't know, if you go to the store, the guy's like, I don't know what tire it is. It's some random tire. You should order it from the manufacturer. Yeah. So that's something that really actually would benefit everybody if it would happen sooner than later, that there's some sort of standardization on these parts that need to be replaced. So, and I think it will happen for sure, but it's just such an early industry. We're talking about like 2 or 3 years. It's just really, really in the baby steps.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely feels like a baby step. And I think that's in part why I've been excited when I came across Mavenoid, because I think that in some ways it's that you're helping map out like what the industry is going to look like from that perspective, because it's we don't have that depth and maturity of the industry like we've had with the auto sector, which has been around for like 100 years. Courtney, look, I think Kristjan is like everything he's talking about is, I think, representative of a lot of early companies who are looking to get into this space. Like I've got a number of companies that I deal with who are thinking about this and are on this journey as well. Talk me through how that would work from your side if you were to start working with a company in this space. Like what would the steps be that you'd go through for being able to help them, and like what stage would they normally engage?
Yeah, I think even starting with the second point first, because I think Puneeth absolutely nailed it on the head of when we're neglecting that customer experience from the get-go. Actually, we're setting ourselves up for greater cost on the line, and ultimately less returning customers, and a need to kind of start panicking around and looking for ways to gain money elsewhere. And with that, I think typically for brands, this type of neglect, kind of the penny drops at a stage when they're being overwhelmed by the amount of contact that they're having from their customers. So they're overwhelmed with a large volume of emails, calls, live chats, whichever channel of their choice, and they're essentially left with two choices of hiring a significant amount more of customer support agents who, by the way, already not feeling very fulfilled in their roles because they're having to deal with repetitive issues on a constant daily basis, or B, continue with doing what they're doing, have long lead times, and ultimately a poorer customer experience. So at Mavenoid, obviously, we try to work for an option C and work with brands to identify what their option C looks like, or even better than that is start working with brands before these issues are even presented to them. So identifying where in the customer journey that customer support needs to be. So is that on the website? Is that in an application? Or even is that on the physical product itself? So if you're looking at a new launch, ensuring that your new brand, your new product is easily accessible in terms of customer support, upkeep, or even just onboarding. I mean, we have one example with Brita, in fact, so Brita water filters, where we've printed thousands of QR codes directly onto their products, meaning that their customers or their installers, technicians know exactly where to look for support without having to Google, without having to search for a phone number. Takes them directly to their product, onboarding instructions, troubleshooting instructions, etc. And then I guess the second thing is identifying how can we preempt some of these issues. So we spoke about repetitive issues that we could see in the owned space, and we can also identify those in the shared space. So preempting order issues, installation guides, product specifications. So we've invested all this time in building this new bike. We have a product specification. Why not expose that to the customer pre-launch, during launch, and post-launch, so they have time to get accustomed to that product. So bring in customer support a bit earlier in the journey. Yeah. And I guess I think it was Puneeth that mentioned earlier about kind of the issues with, well, we don't know the types of problems that are going on with our customers, and typically this is because the data that we're getting from them is essentially phone calls and transcripts that we support teams have to spend hours, and research and development teams have to spend hours going through to identify these themes. So if you have from the get-go an opportunity to learn and get greater insights for the common queries, issues, or even just questions that customers are coming to the brand with, then you're better set up for success. So to answer your question, the earlier the better.
Yeah, I think as well, like the customer like the customer expectations are changing heaps, and one of those things, I love Move, but their like S3 product has been just like a bit painful to watch from the outside, because they've launched this product and like a lot of people are having issues with it turning up with broken things or whatever. And there's some amount of information that'll come in, can come in to them, but there's a lot of people who just get annoyed about it online and post. And I'm waiting for systems or solutions that can like get a little bit more, as you say, Courtney, proactive in that space as well, which are like reviewing what's coming up online and going like, okay, can we categorize this? Is this like a relatively common problem? Can we identify this? Because the worst experience is like getting a bad reputation in this space. Like the Reddit for Move is just a lot of people complaining about customer service stuff, and it's like, that is really, it looks terrible for when people are researching in this space.
Yeah, certainly. And Mavenoid actually does that exact use case that you mentioned there. So utilizing our AI. Yeah. So what we do is we look at information, open information across the web. So that would also include forums, and we'd automatically populate those types of problems, issues, and even solutions that have been suggested alongside that product and brand name directly into where you build out the content for Mavenoid. So we're already looking at how we can be proactive in understanding customer sentiment, other channels that they're looking for support in, and bringing that back into the brand's control.
Oh, okay, great. Well, that's a whole nother area that I didn't even know you did, but that is really really cool to hear. Phenomenal. Well, like, hey, the other thing that I think we're, like at the moment we're talking about stuff as if it's for example, someone building it and then selling it, and then that's the first consumer. One area that I've been very excited about has been this idea of like, as you say, as the market matures and we get more sophisticated in this, I think secondhand markets are really important. And I know you've been doing a lot of this work on this, Puneeth, with Flywheel and what you're looking at. Can you just kind of give a general guide about how this space has evolved, and then what are the kind of issues and areas that make that opportunities that exist for this to get better, so that we can like set up good resale markets and then effectively allow for better financing, et cetera, and like the benefits that'll come from us being able to do that?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, most of the secondary market right now is primarily on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, these types of forums. And we're starting to see more and more bike shops and these smaller local entities that are buying back vehicles within their community and refurbishing them and reselling them. I think in Europe, there's a company called Upway that's doing this for e-bikes, and there's a couple of more peer-to-peer services coming out as well. But I think fundamentally, there's a couple of key pieces of information that are important to have good residual value on the vehicle you're reselling and being able to sell that fast enough. Number one is how easy it is to maintain and verify its health. And that's one of the biggest things that is not available for 90%, 95% of the bikes that are out there. And so the companies that have partnerships with the bike shops or are selling through the bike shops, so the Turns, the Treks, the Giants, the Turns, those generally do really well because these buyers know they can take that to a bike shop and kind of get that vetted. And the only D2C brand that really offers anything close to that is someone like VanMoof. The second is around transparency. I don't think people are necessarily expecting perfect bikes, but they want to know what's wrong with it. And how do you kind of validate that? And so something like a Carfax type solution, I think, would be really important. And number three, I think, is just around trust and being able to verify that these vehicles are owned by that person. Right now, there's just rampant theft for these products, especially in the US. And oftentimes you're kind of getting a bike that's been stolen and that's being resold to you. And when the original owner eventually tracks down that bike, this new buyer is kind of left holding the bag for this stolen product. And so kind of tracing and tracking ownership is, I think, one of the other key trends that I've been seeing. And I think the interesting aspect about this is ultimately the design for the second market and how well a vehicle does in the second market goes back to the original manufacturers, because a lot of these things that we've talked about, how easy it is to maintain, how easy it is to transfer ownership, how easy it is to trace the health of the vehicle, these are all things that need to kind of come from the original OEM. And these are ultimately things that not only help that vehicle in the secondary market, but also help make sure that the experience for the first owner of the vehicle is really positive. And so, I mean, I think manufacturers would be very wise to think about that as kind of a proxy and learning experience that allows them to make the overall product better for however many owners are going to own the bike.
Yeah, Kristjan, jump in.
I just wanted to elaborate on theft. Thank you for bringing that out. I think it's totally mind-blowingly idiotic that you have vehicles that cost thousands of dollars and you can switch them on pressing a button. You know, it's just, imagine you have a car that the doors are always open, and if you go in, you can just start driving. Like, there's so much technology to do it better. If you have even the simplest IoT device, you can make sure that it only turns on from your mobile phone. Look at the Husqvarna mowing robots. The things that run around in your gardens. They cost also thousands of dollars. Nobody steals them just because you need a 4-digit PIN code to start them if you have removed them, right? Or you have to lift them up. You have to put a 4-digit code in. It's that simple, and then you have those millions of e-bikes and scooters being made that you can just turn on from a button. It's just so stupid. It's like, leaving your front door open and asking people to come in. And I just don't get it, why the industry doesn't do anything. On cars, you have immobilizers that were introduced in the 90s, and car theft dropped like 95%. All of the amateur theft was gone, only professionals remaining. And most of the bike theft is just complete amateurs. They just walk by and they cut it or somehow steal it. So this is the most important thing if you really want micromobility to succeed. It's just to add a little tiny bit of technology so you can't steal them that easily.
Yeah, I 1,000% agree. I have a $9,000 e-bike, and it is mental to me that there's no connection. Given that, like, I would happily pay $10 a month to have a connectivity solution that at least allows me to track it, or if it gets nicked, or all these sort of things.
Tracking is like getting it back. But number one thing you have to do is make resale value zero. Like, if you can't turn it on when you have stolen it, then you've already succeeded, right? Because you can't really sell it.
And or locked up the wheels and all that sort of stuff. I agree, and I think that's like, I was giving Move crap before because I know that they've had trouble with some of the reliability of some of their bikes, but I think that is absolutely one area where they've done a phenomenal job of like really getting through the barriers of the challenges of consumers, by doing, yes, you can track the bike, but 2, you also have to have a pin to be able to unlock it, and then 3, you need to, if your bike is stolen, they actually have a service that'll allow you to get the bike back. With bike hunters who go around and track it. So, I mean, I know you've been thinking a lot about this, Puneeth. Anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about theft, I think Kristjan nailed on the head there. It's about reducing the resale value to 0. One of our founders is building a company to help solve bike theft for e-bikes. And the point that he always makes is bike thieves are pretty sophisticated. And in cities like SF, they actually don't even really steal Van Moofs anymore because they know there's no point in stealing it. Those are more likely that someone's going to come after them. And secondly, how are they going to resell it because it won't turn on? Another really interesting kind of solution to this is the Bike Index in the US, which is kind of just like a place where you can register your bike based on the serial number. And the point that the founder of Bike Index makes is in a lot of cities where they go live, any of these bikes that have a very obvious feature or a very obvious registration number, their resale value goes to 0 overnight, because most people that are buying used vehicles are checking something like Bike Index. And Bike Index has an entire army of people that are just passionate about bike theft because their old bike was stolen, that will monitor Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace and Upshop, and they make sure that stolen bikes aren't on there. And just the presence of these types of tools, even if you don't use them, is such a huge deterrent to bike thieves. And I mean, these are obvious and honestly relatively easy fixes that, like you said, it's kind of astounding that people don't do that right now. I mean, something as simple as with Van Moof, for example, if I were to sell my Van Moof to you, Oliver, I can transfer the ownership of that through the Van Moof app. And now, if you're going out to the secondary market and someone's selling you a Van Moof and they refuse to do it, you immediately know that's probably stolen. There's no point buying that. And so these are simple things, but it really just goes back to brands realizing that with hardware, it matters what happens to the hardware once it leaves your door. This isn't a knife or a table, right? You need to think about all of these things post-purchase, and that'll allow you to do very simple fixes, very simple designs that ultimately make the experience better and bring those customers back.
Yeah, phenomenal. Hey, team. I'm realizing we've got time got away on me here, and we've been chatting away. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or in there, and I will happily ask them. But yeah, look, the one thing that I do want to ask, just in the couple of minutes we have left, and if we don't see any questions coming through, is what, like, with the shift. So what I'm seeing in the market is that there's a really big shift towards subscription, that we have a lot of folks who are moving away from necessarily just buying the product, but saying, look, I actually need all the other support that sits around it. And I think subscription's interesting, and we, obviously shared has gone through a really big boom, but there is still a really, it's actually a very solid business now in a lot of cities. It's just away from that. It's not as interesting as it was during the crazy boom period. It's just that, it's now a pretty stable business. Where are you, each of you, excited for the growth, and what do you think that the implications are?
I can maybe start. I think subscription is a wonderful offering for the consumer, but I think subscription is just a fancy word we use because of Spotify. Cars have had this for decades, where you pay leasing, and you also have, I don't know how it's called in English, it's kind of all-inclusive leasing, what they call here in Europe. So you have, insurance, yes, and the financing and everything bundled into one product, and then every 3 years you change your car, right? So it's actually a very old and known concept. And when you lease a car, you don't think about that the car costs $60,000. You think that a car costs you $600 per month, right? So thanks to Spotify, we now call it subscription. But I think it's a very well-known concept, and it works well, and it takes a lot of these worries away from the consumer. So I think it will grow significantly. And it also gives one more thing for the brands. It gives them also very good. If they get a financing partner, it basically gives them positive cash flow from second month already, and long term they can earn more. So yeah, will grow.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
Puneeth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. Subscription ultimately, I think, incentivizes brands to build better vehicles that last longer, that are easier to maintain, and these brands know more about because their bottom line is dependent on that. And so ultimately, I think it improves the user experience pretty dramatically. We've seen a lot of subscription companies right now that I think are struggling, number one, because it's a little bit of an unproven model on top of an unproven vehicle type. And so getting financing partners on board for that has been a little bit challenging for them. And so the kind of intermediate solution we've seen some of the more successful pitches come in, try to do is kind of more of a Peloton-esque subscription model where you're paying for the vehicle, but there's these like all-inclusive plans on top of that, like maintenance, insurance, theft protection, etc. I think that'll probably be one of the best subscription companies. And eventually, once you get the financing faith, but also once you know the residual value of these subscription vehicles, because ultimately that's what the financiers are making their decision on. Once all of that is established, I think you'll see more traditional vehicle or car leasing type models for bikes and scooters. But given that it's early right now, I think you'll see more of I think Peloton type model is probably the best way to go until all of that other stuff is figured out.
Yeah, I really agree with you. Now, I've got two questions that have just come in, and we're right on time, so I'm going to ask these very quickly, and then we'll finish up here. But Kristjan, does Comodule have any plans to sell or retrofit aftermarket GPS IoT for e-bike, e-scooters?
We don't have a product on the market yet. We do have plans.
Marvelous, thank you. And then this was a general question, but it was hardware innovation for shared micromobility, especially on-street charging solutions seems to be a key for reducing operating costs, increasing profitability. But short-term contracts with cities and multiple players in the same market can limit the hardware investment needed to build the needed infrastructure solutions. Do you see any acknowledgement on the part of cities that their contract models are contributing to financial problems within the industry? Kristjan, you run a shared company. Any insights there?
So I would like to believe that we're in the worst place when we look at controlling and limiting and managing sharing scooter companies. So I think a shared scooter is the most managed or controlled product ever in humankind, right? It's the only vehicle ever that automatically reduces its speed. Yes. So in general, I hope that we're in the worst place and the new legislation will actually ease up. But if you look very broader at sharing, I think that there will be roughly the same ratio that in cars, you have privately owned cars and then you have taxis. In some cities like New York, you have a lot of taxis, but I would say roughly it's maybe 1:10, 1:20 is the ratio. And I think we're going to end up somewhere there. So you're going to have, one shared scooter for every 10 privately owned scooters. So it doesn't really even matter how the cities react, but in general, I think that's where you're going.
Yeah, I'll add in there as well, just based on my experience in the space, is that cities are not particularly good at understanding the economics of the operators that are working with them. I think this space will end up being very similar to, like a regulated public transport operator with really, really high things, and that the costs will be reflective of that. And they may well end up being subsidized over time as well, as people realize that. But it will shift more people to owning their own vehicles. All right, hey, and I apologize. I'm conscious we've got actually one more question here, which is that there's need for cooperation between various entities, OEM, software, investors, as the space is developing. Who is at the forefront of organizing that? I like to think that we are at Micromobility Industries, and certainly this is what we're trying to do. That's what we're doing here. The Light Electric Vehicles Association is also trying it, and then there are a couple of others as well around the space. But yeah, feel free to message me directly, and I'm happy to follow up with that. Anyway, hey, look, team, thank you so much for this. This has been really been phenomenally interesting chat, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being here.
I just wanted to say hello to my team. We have an internal hackathon. 150 people are in our warehouse working on new ideas, and I'm on the big screen. So big up, everybody. Hack your
awesome.
socks off.
Wonderful. Hello, Estonia. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Kristjan, Puneeth, and Courtney.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Guys.